The CDC is considering shortening the quarantine period for those who may have been exposed to COVID-19. While right now there's a 2-week waiting period if you've been exposed. In the coming weeks, that number could be dropped down to 7 to 10 days. Joining us with more on that is Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's former FDA commissioner and a CNBC contributor. He also sits on the boards of both Illumina and Pfizer. And Dr. Gottlieb, what's the science behind this? Does it make sense to you?
It does make sense. I mean, frankly, we probably should have done this sooner. The reality is when you look at when people ultimately contract COVID after an exposure, the vast majority of people become contagious, become infected within 3 to 5 days. There are outliers. There's people who would contract the illness 7 to 10 days after exposure. But the number of people that we've seen that actually will contract the infection a full 2 weeks after their documented exposure is very small. And so we need to weigh the practicality of the recommendations that we're issuing against what benefits we're going to derive from them. And asking people to quarantine for a full 2 weeks, to self-isolate for a full 2 weeks because of an exposure is just going to drive more people not to comply with the rules. So we're better off doing something that's practical. 7 to 10 days is going to capture the vast majority of people who are ultimately going to contract the infection after an exposure.
When they say 7 to 10 days, doesn't that automatically assume that most people will say, okay, 7 days and I'm out?
Well, I think most people right now are shortening it on their own, and so that's part of what's probably driving CDC to reconsider this. But the data is the data. When you look at the bell curve of people who will have a documented infection 2 weeks after an exposure, it's exceedingly small. You're talking about case reports. Yeah. The vast majority of people will contract it within a very short period of time. So I think most people are probably self-isolating for about a week and then laying themselves out.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I guess my only question would be, is if you are somebody who gets an infection, but it's an asymptomatic infection, and 7 days later you don't have any symptoms, so you figure you can go back to work, you can go back to school, you can go back to just being out in the community. Is there any concern about that? Or is there a way to make sure that you can get testing even for asymptomatic people so that 7 days later you're clear, you're allowed to go back out? I have to say the guidelines have moved and changed. I'm not even sure what you're entirely supposed to do at a lot of different points with things.
Yeah, the evidence is that people who are truly asymptomatic, so they're not just pre-symptomatic, but they truly stay asymptomatic, they never develop symptoms, their infections, their clinical infection and their period of contagion doesn't last as long of a time. You're most contagious right before you develop symptoms. People who are asymptomatic are probably less contagious. They're contagious for a shorter period of time. So if you're someone who developed an asymptomatic infection, chances are by the end of a 7 or 10 day period, you're not going to be that contagious anymore. You know, nothing's going to be foolproof here. What you're trying to do is balance the recommendations against what's practical and what's going to get the most people to comply. You're better off with recommendations that has more people sticking with some routine that we know is going to derive benefit, rather than putting out recommendations that aren't practical that people are going to ignore, and then you're not doing any good in that scenario.
Yeah, I get that entirely. I guess I'm just confused by the 7 to 10 days thing. Why tell me 7 to 10 days? If 7 days is fine, let me go in 7 days. I mean, that's what businesses will do. That's what schools will do. They'll say, okay, 7 to 10 days means 7 days.
Right. I think that they're going to end up with one or the other, or they're going to have some recommendation that's tied to the nature of the exposure, perhaps, or whether or not you develop certain symptoms within a time frame. But I suspect they'll end up around 10 days. That's where most people are right now in the real world. So I think that CDC is going to end up there. They should have reconsidered this earlier. I think what you're seeing is a CDC that's becoming a little bit more activist now, maybe, you know, has a little bit more freedom to operate, because this is something that should have been revisited, in my view, earlier.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.